Cinephilia is defined as a passionate interest in film, film theory, and film criticism. Since the early 20s, cinephiles have formed clubs and published articles both about specific films and about filmmaking in general. Perhaps the most celebrated burst of cinephilia occurred in post-World War II Paris. A sudden influx of previously banned foreign films reignited interest in cinema among the city's young artists and intellectuals. The late 40s and early 50s showed a marked increase in these informal film clubs, where people would gather to discuss the films they watched and make plans to see more. These informal gatherings gave rise to a focused film community. The discussions became critical and analytical, and one key way participants chose which film to watch was to look for certain directors. While the tendency for filmgoers to form attachment to certain directors had been noticed since the early days of cinema, in the late 1940s people began to make tentative references to the idea of the director as auteur. In English, the word simply means author, but the word applied to film is charged with import. First, it distinguishes film from mere entertainment and designates it as an art form. Second, it requires that every aspect of a film, from the script to the set to the wardrobe, is the director's final responsibility. It is up to the director to use all the elements of the film to make a cohesive, artistic piece. While the idea of auteur theory had been touched on occasionally in film history, it wasn't until two of these Parisian film clubs combined to publish a magazine, and one frustrated young cineast published an essay, that a solid statement of auteur theory became part of regular film discourse. In the early 1950s, two clubs joined forces with the purpose of starting a film magazine. These clubs were Objectif 49, members of which included Robert Bresson, Jean Cocteau, and Alexandre Astruc, and the Ciné-Club des Quartiers Latins, members including Jean-Luc Godard, Claude Chabrol, and soon-to-be-noticed François Truffaut. They put together a magazine called Revue du Cinéma. By 1951, they refined and focused the magazine to become Les Cahiers du Cinéma, the name indicating a formal report on the goings-on of the worldwide film community. The founders of the magazine were acclaimed directors André Bazin, Jacques Daniel Valcruz, and Joseph-Marie Deluca, and the first editor was Eric Domer. In general, the contributors to the magazine were critical of what was commonly called cinéma de qualité. The studio-produced, genre-driven, entertainment-driven movies that had been standard in cinemas during the war and before. These films tended to be formulaic, used predictable characters and storylines, and stuck to safe, non-controversial subject matters. The Cahiers contributors called it cinéma du papa and dismissed it as outdated and unchallenging. In 1954, François Truffaut, a protégé of André Bazin, sought to put his frustration into words in an essay called A Certain Tendency in French Cinema, which is now seen as a landmark statement in defense of auteur theory. In his essay, Truffaut begins by expressing disagreement with film novel adaptations that sacrifice the spirit and intent of a novel to the ease of filming. He questions the idea of an unfilmable scene, for instance, and complains about dialogue that is over-revealing. The filmmakers, he notes, are telling, not showing. He concludes that the distance of the director from the script, the cinematography, and other artistic aspects of the film may be the problem. The same five guys are writing all the screenplays, he points out, and they just hand it to the director when they are done. No wonder all the stories sound the same. But the essay evolves into a comparison of traditional qualité filmmakers and directors that have impressed the film community as artists. He describes the way Bresson remains faithful to a scene in a novel by creative use of camera work in place of a pile of expository dialogue. He points out the differences in setting and dialogue used by directors like Cocteau and Bazin, who make a point to oversee the script. As the essay progresses, Truffaut makes it clearer and clearer that the standout films of their time tend to be auteured, that they were made by directors that kept a hand on all artistic aspects of the filmmaking process towards a final, synthesized vision. The writers of the Cahiers celebrated certain directors as auteurs in French cinema. Jean Cocteau, Tati, and Robert Bresson were among the directors to earn this title. But the Paris cineasts also pointed toward Hollywood filmmakers such as Charlie Chaplin, Howard Hawks, and Alfred Hitchcock. If you walked into a Hitchcock movie, for instance, it had a particular style that announced its director as clearly as a certain painting style announced Picasso. The setting, the story, the dialogues, cinematography, choice of actors, even the wardrobe would tell the observant filmgoer that this was a Hitchcock film. In their repeated discussions of the Auteur theory, the Cahiers contributors pointed out key elements that defined what they called cinéma des auteurs. Subject matter. The Cahiers called for new, less formulaic stories, and very often this meant telling very personal stories. As the collective began directing their own movies, beginning the French New Wave, a great deal of the stories they made had an autobiographical feel. The stories were no longer about historical figures or classic legends, but about people you might meet on the street. Cinematic style. Traditional camera work is smooth and unobtrusive. The camera's job is simply to record the story and follow the action. The new auteurs promoted a more artistic style of camera work, with dynamic camera movement and creative use of angles, close-up, and tracking shots. The camera can now act as a commentator on the proceedings. Mise en scène. This was another item that seemed to be delegated to the same five guys in Cinema de Papa. The set design was left in the hands of the set designer. Auteurs recognized the incredible importance of the mise en scène, the visual synthesis of a scene, in establishing the mood of a film and in helping tell the story. Since the beginning of film, noticed the cineasts, certain directors paid more attention to the mise en scène than others, and that is why films by Fritz Lang and Howard Hawks commanded the adoration of film lovers over decades. Auteur theory is still strongly promoted in today's film community. It is not without its critics. For instance, the late film critic Pauline Kael championed a vision of filmmaking as a necessarily collaborative art, and writers such as Ernest Lehman and Nicholas Kazan imply that the scriptwriter is more properly called the auteur. In any case, auteur theory still helps define the artistic role of the director, and is still used as one of the many tools that current filmmakers have at their disposal.